Velizarius, having settled in Rome, the first thing he did, as in Africa, was to strengthen the walls, which had become considerably dilapidated during the past half-century of barbarian rule. Cracked walls again bristled with teeth, destroyed areas were closed with new masonry. In front of the walls, deepened moat. The Romans viewed these preparations with curiosity, although the most guessing of them were already trembling with terror at the thought of a possible siege. The keys to Rome were sent to Byzantium, as well as the surrendered commander of the Roman garrison Loidorus. Velizarius asked for reinforcements, realizing that his army would not be able to complete the capture of the country in case the Ostgoths still gather their courage and begin to resist for real. Meanwhile, Vitiges, having secured the northern flank of his country, in other words, having confirmed the transfer of Arles and its surroundings to the Franks, drove back to the mountains the Burgundians, who as usual came down to plunder the country during the troubled times, gathered Gothic troops near Ravenna during the winter, and in March moved south. The new king secured his legitimacy by his marriage to Theodoric's granddaughter, Amalasuntha's daughter Matasunta. In addition, Roman hostages were locked up in Ravenna. Leaving the city, the Ostgoths took with them many noble Romans, senators, and heads of influential families. In the army of Vitiges was all the male force of the nation. According to Procopius Caesariusci, to Rome rushed about 150,000 people, and in the Gothic cavalry even horses were dressed in iron armor. Many small towns, which had already managed to defect to the Byzantine side, locked the gates in terror, but Vitiges was only interested in Rome. The only fortress that could delay them a little was the tower on the bridge over the river Antium. But the defenders of the crossing cowardly fled, so that the Goths without stopping marched across the river and ran into Velizarius himself, who with 1,000 horsemen rode out to personally follow the movements of the enemy. Here occurred the first battle of this, still strange, war. The beautiful armor of Velizarius gave him away as a great commander, and the fierce blow of many Goths throughout the battle was directed precisely at our hero. Constantly retreating, losing courageous bodyguards, the detachment of Greeks rolled back to Rome, where the frightened guards, believing that Velizarius has already died, and the Goths will break into the city on the backs of retreating, refused to open the gates. Then Velizarius, squeezed between the moat and the wall, called his companions to the last effort, and without waiting for the approach of the entire army of Goths, attacked the pursuers. The Ostgoths, who thought they were fresh troops from the city, hastily retreated, and this hiccup allowed the Greek commander to finally reach his fortress. The next morning the inhabitants of Rome could see from the walls how large the army that had encamped around the city was. The siege of Rome itself is extraordinarily remarkable and unique in its own way. On the side of the Goths was mighty natural strength and tenacity. On the side of the Greeks were the magnificent walls of Aurelian and the competent, professional approach of a brilliant commander. The huge size of the city did not allow the Goths to surround the city with a solid ring. After several successful attacks, the Goths themselves began to build protected camps, 7 in number, which were located opposite the main roads. Thanks to such a siege from Rome and in Rome could, if desired, to get through, which Velizarius actively used, replenishing supplies, getting gold to pay the soldiers, and once even spent on the walls arrived from Byzantium reinforcements. Vitiges took storms. He built siege towers, ladders, and used the tall buildings that were somewhere outside the walls of the city. Once Velizarius even had to withstand a simultaneous assault from all sides. But strict discipline and great experience allowed the strategist to successfully repel all attacks. Partly for guard duty were involved local residents, and part of the civilian population Velizarius sent away, as the Goths still slowly but surely cut the supply lines, and the city began to have problems with food. The Goths did not touch the refugees from the city. Along with hunger always comes the second misfortune of the besieged. Diseases began to rage inside Rome. The customary unrest was encouraged by the negotiators from Vitiges, who angrily or mercifully persuaded the citizens to stop their suffering and surrender. Meanwhile, the Byzantine bureaucracy had already penetrated Rome, and instead of reinforcements, Velizarius received an order to depose Pope Silverius and place a certain Vigilius on the throne of Peter. This was the first of the so-called Byzantine popes, who showed that the empire did not tolerate independent institutions and appointed the priests itself, as well as all other officials. Pope Silverius, in persuading the Romans to open the gates to Velizarius, fell foul of the Byzantine bureaucracy and was removed. Arrived after negotiations with Theodora, Vigilius promised to soften the position of Rome on many religious issues. In the future, deceived the capital and took the standard rigid and unyielding position. But this will be later. But for now, the removal of Pope Silverius showed the Romans that the rule of the Goths was imperceptible, and the yoke of Byzantium would weigh heavily on all spheres of life. Meanwhile, Velizarius, who had begun to hold Rome with 5,000 soldiers, needed not only kind words and happy omens, but also military aid. The voices of the discontented sounded louder and louder. The townspeople, seeing that the Greeks were successfully defeating the Goths in surprise sorties, demanded a big battle to finally drive Vitiges from the walls of the city. The situation of the besieged further worsened after the Goths all the same thought to capture Ostia, which turned out to be completely without a garrison, and this port city could no longer secretly supply the besieged with food and reinforcements. In these circumstances, Velizarius undertook a big sortie, which ended in a bloody battle, in which the Goths overturned and scattered the townspeople who joined the army. Strangely enough, this cooled the hotheads and restored discipline. In all, by the way, during the siege, 69 battles were fought. Finally, the Goths, themselves beginning to suffer from lack of prospects, food, and malaria, requested a truce. The parties agreed to cease fighting for 3 months, and literally in the first days of the peace, great reinforcements arrived at Velizarius from the capital, landing everywhere in Italy. Suddenly, the empire's units were both in the rear and on the flanks of the besiegers. While before the eyes of the besiegers, boats with provisions for Rome were being taken up the Tiber River, Vitiges received another piece of news. His wife Matasunta, sitting in Ravenna, began to send letters to the empire with hints that she was ready to hand over the fortress to the Greeks. Desperate, the Goths made a couple of attempts to get into Rome by deception. The first, very cunning, discovered the guards. Goths secretly dismantled the rubble on the aqueducts, hoping to get into the city by air. Seeing that they were noticed, the Goths abandoned the idea. The second attempt was revealed by one of the Goths. It turns out the barbarians were preparing to massively poison the guards on one of the walls. Velizarius, meanwhile, did not hesitate to break the truce, and his general John Bloody Dog, acting in the north, besieged Rimini, approaching Ravenna. All this led Vitiges to the idea of returning to the north, and 3 months later, after the truce ended, the Goths set fire to their camps and retreated. They formalized their farewell to Rome in a medieval manner. The noble hostages they had once taken out were slaughtered, and this massacre was another big step towards the disappearance of the famous ancient Roman families from further history. So Theodatus, who once allowed an invasion into the heart of his country, and Vitiges, who concentrated all his army in the swampy Campania, did not conduct simultaneous operations in the south and north, and did not care about the construction of the fleet, led to the fact that the Ostgoths retreated to the north, leaving under the walls of the city of the color of the nation, and began wandering, which will eventually lead to the death of an entire nation. We shall see the capture of Ravenna and the seizure of the Ostgoth crown in the sequel.